Outlaws burn an old veteran's flag. Until he makes a shocking phone call, the wind rustled through the small town of Echo Ridge, a quiet patch of land nestled between sun-bleached hills and winding dirt roads. Most days, not much happened in Echo Ridge, but that all changed one hot July afternoon. Frank Dwyer was a name everyone in town knew. A decorated Vietnam veteran, Frank had lived a quiet life after returning from war. His home sat at the end of Cedar Street, where a tall flagpole proudly bore the American flag he'd brought back from the jungle nearly 50 years ago. That flag had seen more than most people ever would. It was patched, faded, and full of bullet holes. But it meant the world to Frank. One evening, a gang of out-of-town bikers rolled into Echo Ridge. They were loud, brash, and uninterested in the town's quiet customs. The leader, a tattooed brute named Jax, scoffed at the locals' respect for old relics and worn-out traditions. They set up camp near the town park and, as the sun set, decided to make a statement. That night, Frank sat on his porch sipping coffee when he noticed the light from his flagpole had gone out. He stood up, confused, and then he saw the smoke. His heart dropped. By the time he reached the pole, the flag was in ashes, its remnants smoldering in the dirt. A few yards away, the bikers stood laughing, filming themselves with their phones. Frank didn't say a word. He simply turned, walked back inside, and picked up the rotary phone he'd used for decades. With trembling fingers, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Yeah, it's Dwyer," he said after a short pause. "We've got a situation." The next morning, the bikers were still there, loud, obnoxious, and sure they'd made their point. Then they heard it. Engines. But not Harleys. Black SUVs and military-style vehicles rolled into town. Out of them stepped men in suits and others in full tactical gear. They weren't police. They were something else. Something quieter, faster, and far more serious. Frank stood behind them, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Within 10 minutes, the bikers were disarmed, detained, and loaded into the back of a black van. No shouting, no violence. Just a cold efficiency that made onlookers shiver. The townspeople gathered, whispering. "What just happened?" someone asked. Sheriff Hart, who hadn't even been informed of the call, turned to Frank. "Who did you call?" Frank gave a half-smile. "Just a few old friends from my unit. Said they owed me one." He walked back to his porch as a new flag was handed to him. Fresh, crisp, and folded with military precision. But Frank shook his head. Instead, he walked to a box in his living room. Inside was a second flag. The one he'd carried under his jacket after his chopper was shot down in Nam. He hadn't looked at it in decades. Slowly, with reverent care, he raised that flag himself. And this time, no one dared touch it. The days after the incident brought an eerie calm to Echo Ridge. The bikers were gone, and word spread fast, both in town and online. A shaky video of the confrontation had gone viral, a gang of thugs laughing over a burning flag, only to vanish without a trace hours later. The internet was ablaze with rumors. Some said federal agents intervened. Others claimed a shadowy veteran task force had taken justice into its own hands. Frank didn't comment. He just went back to mowing his lawn, feeding the birds, and saluting the flag every morning like he always had. But not everyone was at ease. One evening, Sheriff Hart stopped by Frank's house, leaning on the old porch railing. "You know," the sheriff said, "whatever team that was, they weren't just old army buddies." Frank didn't look up from whittling a piece of wood. "I never said they were." Hart studied the old soldier. "You called in something serious, Frank. I don't mind telling you, it scared folks." "It scared me." Frank finally looked up. "Let me tell you something, son. There are things this country asks of its soldiers that never make the papers. Quiet missions. Quiet men. We made promises to each other. That if one of us ever needed help, no questions, we show up." Hart swallowed hard. "You could have called me." Frank gave a dry chuckle. "You wear a badge. I respect that. But there are threats a badge won't stop. You needed those men gone. Not jailed. Gone." A few weeks later, Frank received a letter. It had no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Inside was a short note. "Dwyer, still owe you for that hill outside Hugh. The boys said it was an honor. Flag looks good. M." Folded in with the note was a medal. Silver star. Frank's name wasn't on it. He stared at it for a long time, then stood up, walked to the mantel, and placed it next to a photo of 12 young men in jungle fatigues, 11 of whom never came home. That fall, The town council held a ceremony in Frank's honor. They wanted to give him a plaque. He accepted it quietly, then asked to speak. He stepped up to the microphone, adjusting his faded green jacket. "I didn't fight for medals," he said. "I didn't fight for parades. I fought for the guy next to me, for the people who couldn't fight for themselves, and for the flag that stands for all of them." He paused. "That flag you saw burning? That was my past. But this one," he pointed to the new flag flying high above the courthouse. "This one is your future. Treat it right." The crowd applauded. Some cried. And somewhere, miles away, in a place the government doesn't list on any map, a group of aging warriors watched the same clip, nodded in silence, and raised a glass to the man who never stopped fighting for what mattered. Winter came early to Echo Ridge. Frost crept across the windows of old homes, and the hills turned silver under the pale morning sun. Frank didn't mind the cold. It made the world quiet, still. He could hear the past more clearly that way. One morning, while sipping his coffee, Frank noticed something odd. A black SUV parked down the road, engine idling. It wasn't from town. Echo Ridge didn't get visitors like that. Not anymore. Frank watched, waited. Finally, a young man stepped out. Military posture, crisp haircut, wearing civilian clothes that couldn't hide the stiffness of recent deployment. He walked slowly up to Frank's porch, stopping at the steps. "You Dwyer?" Frank nodded. "Depends who's asking." "I'm Lieutenant Mason Rourke. My father served with you." "Captain Eli Rourke." Frank's eyes narrowed. Eli. The name hit like a memory-shaped bullet. Eli Rourke had been one of the youngest in their unit. Smart, brave, always joking around with the guys. He died saving 3 of them during an ambush outside Da Nang. "Thought he didn't have any kids," Frank said quietly. "Didn't know he did," Mason replied. "My mother never told me until after she passed. She left me a letter. And a box. With this." He held out a worn leather satchel. Frank took it slowly, hands trembling. Inside was a jungle-soiled journal, a silver Zippo lighter, and a blood-stained photo of the unit, Frank in the center, arm around a young Eli Rourke. Frank stared for a long time. Finally, he looked up. "You want coffee?" Mason smiled. "Yes, sir." Over the next few weeks, Mason stayed in town. He helped Frank with chores, asked questions about his father, about the war. He listened. Not like a soldier, but like a son. And Frank talked, something he hadn't done in years. The stories poured out, the firefights, the friendships, the quiet nights where they didn't think they'd live to see the morning. For the first time in decades, the burden didn't feel so heavy. One day, Mason stood beside Frank at the flagpole. "You know," he said, "I re-enlisted. Special Forces. I've got orders to deploy next spring." Frank didn't flinch. "You sure that's what you want?" "I think so. But I don't want to fight the wrong fight." Frank nodded. "Then fight for the right reasons. For your brothers. For what that flag's supposed to stand for, not what some people think it does." Mason looked up at the flag. "I will. I promise." The town's Memorial Day service came with a surprise that year. Dozens of motorcycles rolled into Echo Ridge, but these weren't outlaws. These were veterans. Riders from across the country, wearing patches from every branch of the military. Word of what happened had spread, and they'd come to pay their respects. Frank stood by the flagpole, now reinforced with a polished steel base. Mason stood beside him in uniform. The 2 men saluted as the flag was raised, Frank's original, the one with bullet holes and frayed edges, now encased in glass beside the courthouse. A speaker crackled. "We dedicate this memorial to all those who fought, who fell, and who came home to keep fighting in silence, in honor, and in service to each other." Frank's name was etched into the stone below, and just beneath it, in smaller script, "So that no man stands alone." Epilogue. Years later, long after Frank passed, a young boy stood in front of the memorial, tracing the names on the stone. He tugged his father's sleeve. Mason, now older, now a colonel. "Daddy, who was Frank Dwyer?" Mason knelt beside him, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. He was a man who answered a call when no one else would. Not for glory, not for pay, but because it was right. The wind picked up, and the flag above them, tattered, bullet-holed, but still flying, saluted the sky.